One day after Congress shut down, President Obama took center stage and announced a historic shift in American policy. He says the United States will remove trade and travel restrictions to Cuba and pursue a closer relationship with the island country. It's not only a highly controversial topic among Cuban Americans, it's also extremely politically charged. Today, we're talking to global journalist and the author of Dateline Havana, the real story of U.S. policy and the future of Cuba. Mr. Reese Elric, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a huge development. We're hearing there could actually be a new American embassy in Havana. This is a complete 180 for American foreign policy towards Cuba. We've seen Russian relations fall apart under President Obama's watch. How do we know things won't sour with Cuba?
Well, of course we don't. It requires a certain amount of trust on both sides. I think they've made good steps. The fact that the U.S. is going to loosen travel restrictions, allow Cuban Americans to send more money to family members in Cuba, and the fact that the Cubans have been willing to exchange prisoners to free Alan Gross, those are all hopeful signs. And hopefully the momentum will carry things forward in a good direction.
Now, this is hardly the first interaction the U.S. government has had with Cuba over the last decade. It's just one of the first public interactions. All the others have been in secret operations. We know Alan Gross was an American U.S. aid contractor, USAID, when he was arrested in Cuba. Why were Cuban officials so upset?
Well, he was basically smuggling in sophisticated communication equipment, supposedly to the Jewish community in Cuba, which is very, very small, a few hundred people. As far as the Cubans were concerned, this was a kind of espionage, trying to stir up dissent against the government. Imagine if Cuban agents had come into New York or Miami and were trying to stir up revolution against capitalism and were passing out sophisticated satellite phones or other electronics equipment. That certainly would have gotten them jailed in the United States, and that's the way the Cubans looked at it there. It was one of a whole series of very recent efforts by the United States to use the internet and cell phone technology to stir up flash mobs, demonstrations, and other anti-government activities, all of which actually have failed.
Now, given your book, did you see this coming? Did you anticipate anything like this happening?
Well, I didn't have a crystal ball, but I did write that it would be beneficial to both countries if the U.S. normalized relations, if the Cuban 5 at that time were released. 3 of them were in this latest incident. And I also wrote about the economic changes in Cuba that were starting to take place, which were taking things in a more positive direction. So yes, the book, although it's a few years old now, I think describes the conditions that we're seeing today.
What was your immediate reaction after you heard the news?
I was surprised and very pleased. This is something that could have been done a long time ago. Really, the Cubans haven't changed all of that much, but the U.S. administration has, and public opinion in the United States, even in Miami and Florida, the majority of people now in the United States now support normal diplomatic relations and lifting the embargo. And even among Cuban Americans, opinion has shifted very strongly on that.
What do you make of the rhetoric now coming out of a lot of Republicans, even Marco Rubio? He was very unhappy about this decision.
Sure.
What do you make of this rhetoric?
Well, I think it's more of the same that we've been hearing. This has been a failed policy for over 50 years. They have no alternative. It's not like, oh gosh, if we don't recognize Cuba, or if we don't lift the embargo, our policy is going to work. It's proven a failure. You can buy American goods in Cuba quite easily. The government there shows no signs of collapsing, despite numerous claims to the contrary. So they have to do something more than just continue to say, oh, hard line, hard line, hard line. That'll hurt the Castros.
But why are most Republicans like Marco Rubio so upset about this? It seems like having travel and trade restrictions removed would only seem to benefit both nations. Why the party line division is what I'm trying to drive at here.
Yeah, first of all, it's not exactly a party line because Senator Flake from Arizona, for example, who's a Republican, and
This is
other
true, yes.
moderate Republicans support lifting the embargo and support diplomatic relations. But and some Democrats like Menendez out of New Jersey take a hard line and oppose it. So it has to do with this. There's a Cuban lobby in particularly in South Florida and New Jersey that is made up largely of the people who came from Cuba in the 60s, who have this extreme ultra right-wing anti-communist view, and apparently nothing is going to change them. So the Republicans who support that view think that they're going to continue to get the money and votes from that community, and aren't about to change.
Here's another question, because we have open trade relations and travel relations with China. They are a communist country. Human rights violations abound there. We have U.S. corporations have factories there. I mean, we have a healthy trade relationship there, albeit it's imbalanced, but nonetheless a communist nation. So it seems to me there's a hypocrisy between those that would criticize a relationship with Cuba because they're a communist nation, when in fact we have the same relationship or a long-standing relationship with China.
Yeah, you've noticed that difference in policy. I'll go you one better. Americans can travel to North Korea, of all places, but we can't travel as tourists to Cuba legally. So it's a function. It's one more indication of the dysfunction in American foreign policy and the inconsistency. The U.S. is isolated in the UN. It's isolated in Latin America now. More and more countries of Latin America are insisting that Cuba participate in the multilateral groups there. The U.S. is isolated, and now this change in policy is a reflection of that.
So what do you think was the actual motivator behind Obama to step out and make this historic announcement?
Well, as I said, one was the fact that the U.S. was under a lot of pressure within Latin America. Two, public opinion in the United States for a long time has been in favor of normalizing relations and lifting the embargo. So hopefully we'll move in a direction to lift the embargo as well. Frankly, the Obama administration has given up any hope of having meaningful cooperation with the Republicans, I guess, in the last 2 years. So we saw the unilateral actions on the immigration policy, which I think was a step in the right direction, and now we're seeing it in diplomatic realm. It is ironic that the Republicans are decrying the imperial presidency of Obama when they would feel free to invade countries with no congressional approval or set up Guantanamo despite being overruled by the Supreme Court. And the Republicans have been famous for having their imperial presidencies, but they support that insofar as they like the policies that are being carried out.
Now, the White House has said that Alan Gross's release was based on exclusively humanitarian grounds. Meanwhile, we release prisoners to Cuba. On the surface, it appears to be a prisoner swap, but the White House begs to differ. What do you think is behind that line that we're getting from the White House?
Yeah, well, the White House is doing a little fandango here, a little sleight of hand, if you will. They never admitted that Alan Gross was guilty of anything. They claim he was a victim of injustice, false charges in Cuba. But while they are holding the Cuban 5, or 3 of them anyway, and they had been duly convicted under law, so they didn't want to do a prisoner exchange for someone that they didn't consider had been legitimately arrested in the first place. So they threw in another guy who's so far unnamed, who was a Cuban national who spied for the United States, who was a spy. And the U.S. acknowledges that he was a spy, and the trade officially was the 3 Cubans held in U.S. federal prisons in return for that one spy. That's the official exchange, and that Gross's release was a humanitarian gesture. That's the official version. In fact, it was a prisoner exchange.
Now, I've seen headlines that say Obama surrendered to Cuba. Obviously, it's a laughable headline intended to invoke some emotion. But which country do you think is giving more ground in this negotiation, the U.S. or Cuba?
Well, I think both sides gave up something. The Cubans, for a long time, have opposed various efforts by the United States to meddle in its internal affairs, and Alan Gross represented that. So he was duly convicted as far as the Cubans are concerned. So giving him up was significant. Opening up diplomatic relations, while on the whole is positive, it also means there's going to be a lot more U.S. personnel in Cuba and the potential for more spying. So the Cubans gave up something. And the United States, of course, gave up something by releasing the prisoners. But I think that's the nature of these diplomatic compromises. Everybody gives up something, everybody gains something, and it's a win-win.
Now, Alan Gross was with USAID, and according to the reports from the Associated Press, USAID projects they had projects on the table to infiltrate Cuba with rappers and the internet. However, it failed. Now the USAID director is losing his job. Is he one of the so-called sacrificial lambs here? Was he political collateral for Cuba to accept Obama's offer?
I don't know if they made that a condition, but the USAID policies in Cuba have been a disaster for quite some time now. I wrote an article for Global Post detailing how the U.S. was giving out free smartphones in Cuba that contained propaganda information that was a complete bust. There was the rapper incident. There was Associated Press has written numerous articles. There's been one disastrous effort to meddle in Cuba's affairs after another. They didn't work, and the guy in charge of them is being cut loose. It's that simple.
Now, President Obama said in his speech that this allows the government to pursue American interests. What are the possible benefits of this deal? Who comes out on top here?
Well, if the additional numbers of Americans can now travel to Cuba, tourism is still technically illegal, but they've expanded the use of the general license. That is, for example, as a journalist, I can go, professors can go to do research, people in other professions can go, and I suspect there'll be less scrutiny at the borders when you come in through Miami or other airports. Already somewhere over 100,000 Americans visit Cuba every year anyway, and simply ignore the embargo.
Do you think we'll see direct flights by some of the major airlines into Cuba now?
Well, that would probably require official lifting of the embargo and allowing of tourism. Right now, of course, there are daily flights, but they're conducted by charter companies, not by official airlines. And anybody who wants to go to Cuba can go through Toronto or Mexico City or any number of other countries. There's no realistic checking at most of those cities for people going to Cuba. But the real controversy will come if Congress takes up the issue of lifting the embargo altogether, and that would allow, for example, U.S. oil companies to invest in offshore oil, to invest in the nickel industry and other industries in Cuba. That would make a huge difference for both countries.
All right. Reese, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That was journalist and author Reese Elrick. You can find out more about him at reeseelrick.com. Up next, we've got today's special reports, and Amanda Gabriel will have your daily digital report. Stay tuned to WHDT World News. We'll be right back.